The question of what the proper role of the media has come up quite a bit during this past election. And of course, there's been a lot of criticism about how the mainstream media has addressed certain candidates, including Donald Trump. Well, recently, Michael Wolff, who also considers himself a journalist, was interviewed by Digiday. And during this interview, he talked about what he believes the proper role of journalists should be, and how journalists have actually moved away from that by doing pesky little things like sharing opinion or maybe even fact-checking. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I've lived through a lot of presidents. I've lived through Nixon.
So he doesn't require the media to change the way it covers.
I think what is required is for the media to do its job, and I really deeply feel that the media hasn't done its job, has done its job badly, hasn't done its job, has often abdicated its responsibility, has lost itself somewhere. I don't even know where they are. And right now, this is an interesting moment in which the media suddenly looks at Donald Trump as a threat instead of looking at Donald Trump as a story. And I might add, possibly the biggest story of our time, maybe the most interesting story, and certainly a story that needs to be told in rather conventional ways. Who are these people? What do they want? What motivates them? Where are they from? Where are they going? Just basic storytelling.
So he's going to elaborate a little more in the videos that we're going to show you about what he means by basic storytelling. But his biggest grievance with current day journalists is that they don't simply transcribe what people in power say and then just leave it at that. He thinks that's the role of a journalist. You don't do the fact checking, you don't share context, you don't share any of that. You just go ahead and report what one side says, what the other side says, and that's it. You just leave it at that. And honestly, look, he's getting a lot of heat for what he's saying, but this is not a new idea. This is actually something that a lot of people who work in media believe you should do. They think it's actually unethical to go out of your way and tell the audience or tell your readers, who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah, I think also it reminded me of something I read today before knowing about this Michael Wolff story, which is something that Christiane Amanpour, who is an accomplished capital J journalist, had said, and she said it at I think in the last day or so. She accepted an award Tuesday, it was yesterday, from a group called the Committee to Protect Journalists, and she said that she believes in being truthful, not neutral.
Yes.
And which is such a beautiful way of putting exactly why Michael Wolff is wrong here into some kind of perspective. Because like you said, Anna, or like you hinted anyway, I think that Wolff I don't think he's dictating. He's saying this is what he thinks should be and this is where we've lost our way. I just totally disagree with it.
Yeah, I think that it's actually a very harmful way of explaining what a journalist's role is, because we're already seeing that fear among people who work in the mainstream already, the fear of being criticized for taking a side, right? And so look, here on this show, we're very clear about the fact that we come from a progressive perspective. The facts are the facts, you can't change that, but we share our opinion on the stories after we give you the facts, and then you guys can decide whether or not you agree with us or not. A lot of you disagree a lot of times, and that's okay. But in this case, you have news outlets like CNN that don't do actual reporting. Look, every time I travel for the Fusion show, my favorite thing to do is watch CNN when I'm in the hotel room, because I want to be aware of the way that they report, and I don't want to sit here and criticize them unless I know what they report and how they report it. The ongoing story is where Melania Trump is going to live once Donald Trump is inaugurated. You can spend 5 minutes on that story. It's not that important. But they focus on a non-story for days, and I think it's because it's an easy thing to cover without worrying about sharing your opinion or anything like that. And then they also have Donald Trump come on, or they'll have, some other politician come on, and let's say they're both disagreeing with one another. they'll just let the two sides share whatever it is that they think, and then they won't do any fact checking. And so they're confusing objectivity with neutrality, and that's something that you see in the mainstream media a lot. And a lot of people don't have the resources to go out of their way and be journalists for themselves. You're supposed to be doing your job and let them know who's lying, who's telling you the truth.
Yeah, and you know, and CNN has what a lot of other people who want to do citizen journalism don't have, which is editors, people that are fact-checking, going through. So when they do a story, which is very different than when they do commentary and when they have a guest on, when they do a story, generally speaking, those what are called news packages, those have been vetted, and those reporters are working, and they're talking to sources, and whether it's about whether Melania Trump will live or not, or whether it's about Syria, or whether it's about water contamination in New Mexico, it doesn't matter. There are people that are script supervising and looking at those scripts. But that's the problem when you're 24-hour news, is then you get on and you put two people up there talking about water contamination. One person saying, well, it's not contaminated. The other person saying it's contaminated. Nobody's checking those facts.
That's right.
And that is the perpetuation of something like CNN, and that's what makes it very difficult.
Media and journalism is not meant to be a platform in which you give people in power the ability to share whatever it is that they believe or whatever lies that they want to tell. The whole purpose of media in the beginning was muckraking. Like, that's what really appealed to me in terms of like journalists and what they do. It was about holding people in power, specifically businesses, accountable for their actions. Businesses hated journalists, when journalism really started here in the United States. And now it's been completely perverted into like this nonsense that you see. And to hear someone like Michael Wolff advocating for that is really depressing. So let's go to video number 3, where he talks about how journalists should be stenographers.
That group was, really seems quite content in giving up any pretense of at least one key function of journalism is just to represent the facts. And
but we don't want to be stenographers either. I mean, there's a balance there, right?
Well, first thing, yes, you do want to be stenographers. That's what journalism is about. That's a very significant piece of journalism. To be a stenographer. We don't want to hear you. Write it down. Write what the information is. Take it down. You're there to literally convey what someone says, someone in power, what they say, and you bring it to people who want to know. That's stenography. This stenographer, that's bad. Screw you. That's not bad at all. Do you have any idea? In one of I can kind of do a little digression on my belief that journalism is now a profession filled with people who have no experience as journalists. They're all under the age of 25 and talking to other people under the age of 25. Right. So let me send the message. Stenographer, that's what you're supposed to be.
And, later on he was talking about how, these people are just jealous because I scored an interview with Steve Bannon. I don't know, man. In that answer, it really sounded like you're jealous of young journalists who are actually disrupting the type of media that you think is good. And look, he also says, Donald Trump's elected now, okay? The time of opposition is over. Now all you're supposed to do as a journalist is report what he does and what he says, and that's it. That's all you do. There's no time for opposition now. It's too late. It's over.
First of all, I should disclaim this by saying that I read the book that Michael Wolff wrote about Rupert Murdoch, and it was great, and he's a great writer. And I think even listening to him say a foolish piece of nonsense about this, which is what I think this is, it does also betray that he's not a dumb guy, even in the way he's saying it and how his opinions are formed. He's a smart guy and he's a good writer. He is somebody, though, who I think you're right, Anna, seems so envious of the way his business has changed. And his business, he's not an in-the-field reporter. He was an editor at a magazine. He's a writer. Yep. He has covered media more than he has been in media. So, who are we to say if he's envious of it? But it certainly sounds in those remarks like he was. But let me put this in some context. I was, in reporting this last election, out at different events where people who were at Trump events would look at one another and they would say, what do we do with that, right? About
Yep.
whatever it was that Trump said. And it was a prevailing, sort of cool idea in the way of like, let's everybody sign up for the Muslim registry. Well, we don't know if that's going to happen, but let's just write down what he said and not say anything, because whenever we say anything about it, nobody listens to us anyway. All they're doing is listening to him and becoming fascinated. So there's an exasperation that makes you say, maybe that's what we should do. But that's an extreme, and he sounds very serious about it here, which nobody was serious about it. They were sort of saying, well, what difference does it make what we say? Because just say what he said and go home.
Look, if he's trying to make an argument that, all of these opinions are unnecessary and you should do straight reporting, fine. But straight reporting has been completely misinterpreted.
Right, he's saying stenography.
Stenography. So essentially all you do is transcribe what someone in power says, and you allow them to utilize your platform as a way in which they can get out any type of message, be it a deceptive message, be it a destructive message, it doesn't matter. And so then there's really no role of the media. If all it is a vessel in which people in power use to like spread misinformation or spread their whatever, then I don't know, there's really no purpose of journalism, honestly.
Yeah.
It's supposed to challenge those in power, not just serve as a platform for them.
Right, absolutely. And Gwen Eiffel, who we lost this week, who, in reading so much about her, one of the things that stuck with me that she said this week was that journalism, it should be something that you approach when you are a journalist, you should approach everything with skepticism, but not cynicism.
Yes.
And so what Michael Wolff is saying, don't approach it with anyism. He's just saying, don't even approach it, which isn't journalism, right? I mean, you're just saying you're reading back a transcript, and
Exactly.
that's not. Then you don't need the journalist, right? Well, you do need the journalist.
Well, people, of course, gave him a lot of criticism after he had this interview with Digiday. And Glenn Greenwald, who I believe is a real journalist, also criticized him. But what I found funny is that people went into his Wikipedia page and they edited the page to indicate that he is a stenographer. And so he shouldn't contest that. He thinks stenography is awesome, that he thinks that's what the main role is of a journalist. I want to go to graphic 6. He did respond to the criticism in a tweet, and here's what he had to say. I didn't say it's the only job, but it clearly is a basic one. Why even deny it? Self-promotion, self-dramatization? Come on. So, look, here's the issue. I think that there is a problem with some journalists, even digital media, members of digital media, who make the story about them, who are more interested in becoming the story. And I think that breaks, some journalistic ethics that I agree with. I don't think the story should be about you. The story should be about the information and fact-checking what it is that anyone in power is saying, right? If you have two sides, don't treat both sides like they're completely equal. One side might be lying, so you want to look into it. Both sides might be lying. Right. You want to look into it, and you want to make sure you give the audience accurate information. Opinion is another thing, everyone has their opinion. And I think it's actually a lot better when a member of the media shares what his or her opinion is, so you know where they're coming from. Because the reality is, whether they share that opinion or not, they have an opinion. And so sometimes it comes out in different ways when they're pretending that they're being objective.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, and listen, he clearly feels passionately about this. He's not, what you have to respect about this, even though it seems absurd to me, is that he's dug his heels in on it, and he's not saying, no, that's not really what I meant. I mean, he said, it's not the only way of doing it, but it clearly is part of it. I just totally disagree with him, because then you're taking an element out of this, and this is an unusual year, because journalists who have always been objective, and that doesn't mean neutral, but objective, and that goes against what Christiane Amanpour said. But she said you have to be truthful, not objective, and that's true as well, obviously. But this year, people have wanted to, who never have before, take a side in this election because of what they saw as this totally out of bounds way that Donald Trump was treating the media. You get treated poorly, you don't just lie down and get treated poorly like that. And a lot of people saw that. And so this year, that instinct to be that way made it very difficult for journalists to sort of contemplate their role, which is where I think Wolff is coming from. But the way he's defining this role is ridiculous.
So you just brought up, another huge story that I didn't cover, but I'm sure TYT covered. Donald Trump calling, the biggest names in news to Trump Tower and basically scolding them as if they had done like an effective job in criticizing him or holding him accountable for his actions. The mainstream media essentially gave him a platform where he could spread his ridiculous ideas. He could call in, okay, with a crappy graphic and say whatever the hell he wanted, and they barely even challenged him or questioned anything he had to say, but it still wasn't enough, right? He literally invited them to Trump Tower so he can scold them for not doing a better job in being nicer to him. So there's a big problem with what's happening in the media right now. And look, I don't care if it's a Democrat or a Republican doing that. That is unacceptable behavior, and it's even more unacceptable if media outlets comply with that kind of garbage.
You know who makes independent media possible? You guys. Because of you, we can actually do this show free of any outside influence. That's what makes us so strong. Become a member today. tytnetwork.com/join. You are the media.